My first tip for creating a greater sense of realism in our drawings is to use lighter lines for distances further away than we use for closer distances. And where we have a significant depth of plane in our scene, we can go from heavier, darker lines to lighter lines to still lighter again lines. And we can achieve this both by varying the pressure with which we use our pen, or possibly by using a range of pens of different thicknesses. And this works for a scene of a very far distance. It works for a scene of less distance. And it also works for scenes where all of the objects are relatively close. We certainly get a sense that these branches here are significantly closer than these branches over here. So using lighter lines in the distance helps create a sense of distance, and that adds to our sense of realism. Which brings us to our second way of creating a more realistic effect, and that's to vary the values that we use so that we have darker values in the front closer objects and lighter values for the further objects. And by value, I simply mean our lights and our darks. We can see that by using these lightest values for the castle in the distance of Edinburgh, these closer, darker values have a sense of coming forward, of being closer. And we've also combined our first point of heavier lines for closer objects and lighter lines for further objects as well. Again, it doesn't have to be such a long distance. We can still use darker values for closer up and lighter values further away, and lighter values not even that much further away to help give a sense of depth. And of course, this also works in nature, where as our values become relatively lighter, it helps gives a sense of them moving back. Not just for these rocks that we have here in this waterfall, but also in the overhanging foliage, where the darkness of this foliage brings it forward, the more mid values here and here sets it further back, and this lightest value of foliage up the back helps give a sense of this is some distance away. But we don't only create value, lights and darks, using markers. We also create value with our pen lines. The thickness of our lines and the closeness with which we draw them together creates the effect of value. And by manipulating that line work so that we get stronger values closer and lighter values further back, helps create a realistic sense of depth. And this sometimes can be quite subtle, particularly where a lot of our scene is relatively close. We can still create a nice sense of realism by varying the value we create with our line work in certain parts of our scene. It helps define what would otherwise be a tangle, as well as creating a sense of depth. And our third way of creating a greater sense of realism is by reducing the detail that we try and draw as we move further away. So in this wharf scene, the detail on this wharf is much more than the detail we use for these buildings in the far distance. However, it's also relevant in scenes that aren't of such great contrast of near and far. By including more detail for the very closest objects, such as adding grass, more detail with this stump, detail with these cars, more detail in this fence, particularly in the parts that are closer, both in accuracy of drawing and including the shadows and the shade that it creates, lines to indicate depth. With this building here, giving greater attention to the details, the architectural details that we add there than we do with what's across the road, and more details even with these buildings here than with these buildings here. We mimic the effect of real life, which is simply that we see more detail for things that are closer. Our fourth point is to avoid lots of unbroken lines. When we observe things in life, particularly large objects from a distance, we don't see all of the object at once. Rather, we focus on individual parts and jump in a visual sense, leaving out some parts to other parts that stand out for one reason or another. And by leaving slight gaps in our line work, we mimic this effect of real life in our drawing. Sometimes even in a brisk gestural drawing, we get a greater sense of realism by some of the gaps that appear in our line work, by some of the details that we don't draw, actually stop it from becoming artificial and wooden and heavy looking. Sometimes, in fact, we don't really want to draw lines at all, as often is the case with subjects such as weathered rocks, where to draw a line, an unbroken line, would actually create an edge, a sharp edge that we really don't see in real life. Other times, leaving gaps can work well with curvature of objects, where part of what we see is moving away from us. A smooth, unbroken line can actually create a smoothness in the object, which we don't actually have in real life. And in fact, a broken, somewhat jagged line, as well as quite frankly being easier to draw accurately, in fact, creates a more realistic effect. If we look at these pavers here, we see in fact that a lot of the lines aren't joined up. We don't want this area to be darker than this shadowed area simply because we've drawn all of the lines heavily in ink and created a much darker value than we see in real life. So we want to avoid long unbroken lines. Another important way to create a realistic effect in our drawing is to remember our depth lines. And by depth lines, I mean these lines that create a sense of three dimensions, that create a sense of not just height and width, but depth. And one of the important things about depth lines is that they very often create the space where we can add shade. And by taking every opportunity to create a sense of three dimensions, then clearly we increase the effect of realism in our drawings. Because if we don't put these depth lines in, we end up with a very flat, cartoon-like effect. Could be making sure that we have spaces that create depth when we look up, whether we're looking up behind a colonnade or up into the roof of a pediment. And at other times, our depth lines can be relatively simple, even gestural, even rather loosely defined as to exactly what line is defining what edge, because it's usually the effect that we create with our lines, not the exactness of the detail, which is important. So avoiding cartoon effects in our drawings by always adding the depth line wherever we have opportunity is a great way to create a realistic effect. If I can make two quick points now, I just want to say, firstly, I have saved what in my mind is the most important point till last, till number 12. It's also the one that I think possibly you're least likely to have heard or to be taken into account when you draw. So if you tire partway through, at least zip to the end and catch the last point. And my other point for right now is that you're noticing I'm not actually drawing for this video, but I'm using drawings that I've already used in previous videos. So if there's any particular drawing where you're thinking, I would love to know more detail about how he drew that, what his thought processes were, there is a video where I go through exactly that. So if you look back through my thumbnails, when you find that drawing on the thumbnail, whatever else that video shows, it will include in the voiceover my thinking as I drew that particular scene. But let's get back to the points on how we can create a realistic effect in our drawings. This one won't be popular, but if we want to capture a realistic effect in our drawings, we have to draw the perspective accurately. And it doesn't matter whether it's a relatively small structure or a much larger one. And it's not just the structures, but the decorative elements on the structure also need to have their perspective correct for the angle with which we're viewing it. And it doesn't matter whether it's relatively simple perspective or whether it's a more extreme perspective and a more unusual viewing angle. If we want to capture a sense of realism, then we have to get the perspective correct. I have a couple of perspective playlists if you're interested in more from me on perspective. And it's not just the perspective of individual objects, it's also getting the perspective consistent within the entire scene. That's important as well. So if we want to draw scenes that have a sense of realism, then we need to learn to capture the perspective in an accurate way. Just one example for this way we can create a more realistic effect in our drawing, but that's to vary the thickness of our line within the one subject. So for this light fluffy eiderdown, there's a contrast between the lines I've used for the wooden base of the bed and the lines I've used to define the eiderdown on top. Even within the eiderdown, some lines are lighter and some are darker, depending on what those lines, those marks, are trying to define, what effect they're trying to create. Whether it's the edging, whether it's areas where gathering creates shade, whether it's areas where fabric is pulled together and stitched down in a way to create patterns, and also the effect of the stuffing and the various marks of tension that can introduce in the fabric. You'll also notice there are lots of gaps between my lines here as well. All of this has helped to create a much more realistic effect. This next technique for creating a sense of realism in our drawing is to do with hatching or cross-hatching. Now, in the end, how we hatch is totally up to each person. But in my opinion, a greater sense of realism is achieved by hatching in a direction which emphasizes the underlying form of the object that is being hatched. So for instance, on this low box hedge here, it's basically a vertical shape. So my hatching is vertical. But again, note the broken edge along the top. On these heavily shaped trees, it's not as straight. So I've created a sense of the way the branches have been pruned and therefore the way the foliage grows. And where we have an overhanging section here, in the overhang where the foliage slopes backwards, I've done my hatching sloping backwards. But it can be in a simple drawing as a tree, where the clumps of foliage of the tree canopy, I do the hatching to represent the shade that roughly follows the direction of these shapes. And with the trunks and the branches, I emphasize the round circular nature of those shapes, mostly by using horizontal hatch lines. Sometimes it can be effective to do our hatch lines following the perspective angles that a horizontal line at that place in our drawing would have. And sometimes hatching to emphasize the underlying form can be quite complex, but it can create a very realistic effect, such as in this pine cone, where I've separated each of the planes of each of these protruding knobs that have held the seed packed in behind them before they all opened up. And instead of what could have been a tangle of lines, we've created a nice realistic effect that captures not just the shadows, but the underlying form of the structure as well. It can be simpler in something such as this old pair of boots, where on this one I chose to emphasize the vertical plane of this part of the boot, whereas on this line down one I emphasize the cylindrical effect with my hatching lines. This grotesque from Notre Dame, you can see again I've used hatching line direction to emphasize the different curvatures of the form that I'm looking at, whether it's curling under the chin here or whether it's a lesser curve down here. And again, you'll also notice that I've varied my line thicknesses. I've got gaps between lines. I've tried to avoid long unbroken lines that would create a sharp edge which we do not see in this weathered stonework. So, to create a sense of realism, choosing the line direction in our hatching is a very important consideration of what will emphasize, what will strengthen our ability to perceive the underlying form of the building, as well as what sort of value effects are we wanting to create. Another great tip to create a sense of realism in what we draw is to avoid, particularly at the start of the drawing, doing long, straight, unbroken lines at the base of a building where the building hits the road. Very seldom is that a helpful line to have to create a sense of realism. Far better to do a series of dots so that we get a sense of the perspective angle and of where that line is. But then as we draw the detail onto it, around it, we're not hampered by something that's going to fight against our ability to create a sense of 3 dimensions. Because in fact, at ground level, we often have all manner of bits and pieces blown up against the base of a building that does create a jagged effect. We do not usually get a nice smooth line. But if we draw one in quickly at the start because we're trying to block out the overall structure, the overall perspective angles, it really can stop us creating the effect that we want to create at ground level, which is always a key part of a street scene. So we need to resist the urge of the long, hard, straight line at the start, maybe settled for a very, very light line, if we can manage it with our pen, or possibly more helpfully, a series of dots that we can use to help position our vertical lines while we work out what the silhouette edge of the base of the building is going to be. This next way to achieve greater realism in our drawing is simple, but I often see it not done, and that is to simply remember to put in the shadows on the ground for whatever's in our scene. Imagine if these shadows weren't under these cars. All the difference omitting the shadows would be in this small flock of ibis. In our focus on drawing in our mind the subject, it's easy to overlook the shadows that are cast. And yet the shadows are also a way of creating context because they help us show the ground and the texture, in this case the grass, that the birds are standing on. Now, sometimes the shadows can be relatively light affairs, and other times, such as in this beachscape, the shadows are actually quite small because the sun is almost overhead, but they are very black, and the black collar that it rings many of the stones with, as well as revealing the shape of these rocks, also important for creating a realistic sunny day effect. The contrast between these very black areas and the unbroken white of the sand is a really important part. And the other important thing to remember is that shadows aren't necessarily just a few moments of afterthought, a few horizontal lines we hurriedly put on our paper. Shadows need to follow the overall perspective of the scene, and shadows also need to reflect the surfaces that they are on, a bit like the hatching. And we need to give shadows the attention and the ink work they deserve, whether they're simple or whether they're more complex. I have many videos on this, but another important way we can capture a realistic effect in our drawings is to draw the effect of the detail, not to get bogged down drawing the actual detail. And I think this quick sketch in Montmartre is a good example using the paving stones, the fan-shaped patterns of the cobblestones on the ground as an example. They're an important part of the scene. They're an important part of the place. So we certainly need to draw them in some way. But the challenge is to strike the balance between drawing enough in a way that we can now recognize and see these cobblestones without having to draw them all, because the main subject is still the children looking over the edge at the city of Paris. And I find that it's in drawing trees that drawing the effect of the detail is most important, where we don't get bogged down in trying to draw individual leaves, but we try and capture the effect of the foliage that we're seeing. And it's not just capturing the effect of foliage, it's capturing the effect, the feel, the visual distinctiveness of the particular foliage of whatever tree we're looking at without having to start, though, drawing leaf after leaf after leaf. And drawing the effect of the detail works for architectural detail as well, where how much we draw depends on how close it is, and we simplify and draw less as we move further away, whether it's sculptures or whether it's decorative elements on various surfaces. Learning to draw the effect of the detail is a really important way of capturing realism. I have saved the most important till last, and in some ways this ties in a number of the other ones. But if we want to create a strong realistic effect in our drawing, I find that more and more important is to not think of a drawing as something I create by putting lines on paper, but to think of it as something I create by putting marks on paper, some of which are lines. And I find that I get a greater sense of reality when I use as many different types of marks as possible in my scene. So in this natural scene, in this glimpse through a small stand of relatively young eucalyptus trees, I certainly do use lines, and we can see those emphasizing the tree trunks and some of the branches. But far more ink has gone into much smaller marks, much shorter marks, and a variety of weights of marks to create the effect of the various textures that we have, taken into account ones that are closer, ones that are mid-ground, ones which are far distant. When I think of drawing lines, it's easy just to think I've got to draw outlines of the object, and that's how I draw it. I draw the outline. No, the outline is just one element of an object and of a drawing that we can manipulate to create a sense of realism in what we draw. But there are many others. And I find thinking marks rather than lines is particularly important for quite complex subjects. Not complex because of the inherent object itself. This old shed is not exactly the Palace of Versailles. But to create the textured effect of all the branches, of all the plants around it, as well as its broken and weathered surfaces, I need a variety of marks that I can incorporate. And it's even more important when we have a very cluttered scene of many objects overlapping that we view through, is to think marks rather than lines, and to create as much variation as possible to create a sense of separation so that we don't get lost in the overlap, that we can still see through clearly, as well as create a sense of difference between natural surfaces and man-made ones. And sometimes we can create quite strong areas of contrast with our marks, both in value, but also in what the object is. We can use lines to create areas that are more clearly man-made structures. And of course we can, as I mentioned earlier, create a sense of distance with how we manipulate the relative placement of all of these marks. Or we can use marks relatively simply for relatively simple subjects to create really a quite delightful overall effect of realism, even though we've drawn it with what is in effect a very light touch and omitting much of the detail that we can see in our reference. By using marks and a variety of marks combined in a sensitive way, we can still end up with a very strong sense of realism, that this is a real cottage somewhere that people live in. And we can almost imagine walking in off the street onto that front veranda. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Wanting to draw subjects that look more realistic is a common goal for many people. These are 12 ways, 12 techniques I have to try and capture as strong a sense of realism as I possibly can, whatever I'm drawing. Look, I hope these have been helpful, and I'd love to hear in the comments the one that you've decided you need to work on. But whatever you're drawing, whether you're trying to make it look realistic or not, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.